What became of the women who sat closest to Adolf Hitler, not on the battlefield, not in the halls of government, but in the quiet rooms where the Führer dictated his orders, drafted his letters and spoke his innermost thoughts aloud? They were not generals. They were not ministers. They were not ideologues whose names would be splashed across the front pages of history. And yet, these women occupied a peculiar and deeply intimate position inside the heart of the Third Reich, recording its words, bearing witness to its decisions, and surviving its collapse. What happened to Hitler's secretaries after the war ended? Did they face justice? Did they speak the truth? Did they live with guilt? Or did they simply carry on? In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. To understand what happened to Hitler's secretaries after World War II, it helps to understand exactly who they were and what their work involved. The Führer Hauptquartier, or Führer headquarters, was not merely a military installation, it was a self-contained world unto itself, a bubble of power where the decisions that shaped the fate of hundreds of millions of people were made and transcribed. The secretaries who served Adolf Hitler were not ordinary office workers. They were privy to conversations that never made it into official documents. They typed his speeches, his correspondence, his memoranda, and in some cases portions of his personal writings. They worked in close proximity to one of the most destructive men in human history, day after day, year after year. And when the war ended in May 1945 and the Nazi regime collapsed into rubble and ash, these women faced a world that would ask them uncomfortable questions. Who were they really? What had they seen? What had they known? And what did they choose to remember? Hitler employed a small circle of personal secretaries throughout his years in power. The most prominent among them were Johanna Wolf, Christa Schroeder, Traudl Junge, and Gerda later known as Gerda Christian. Each of these women came to the role through different circumstances, served at different times during the Nazi period, and emerged from the war with very different fates. Some spoke candidly about their experiences, others remained guarded and defensive for decades. Some grappled publicly with guilt, others insisted they had simply done a job, that they had been young, naive, and ignorant of the full horror unfolding around them. Historians have long debated how much credence to give these claims, and the debate has never been fully resolved. Traudl Junge. Of all Hitler's secretaries, none has become more famous or more closely scrutinized than Traudl Junge. Born Gertrude Humps on March 16, 1920 in Munich, Bavaria, she grew up in a Germany shaped by the trauma of World War I and the economic catastrophe of the Weimar Republic years. Her father was an army officer who had served in the First World War, and her family background was solidly middle-class and broadly patriotic in the manner common to many German families of the era. She showed an early interest in dance and the performing arts, and as a young woman she harboured ambitions that had nothing to do with politics or government service. The rise of the Nazi Party and the transformation of Germany in the 1930s formed the background noise of her youth, as it did for millions of her generation. In late 1942, at the age of 22, Traudl Humps applied for a position as a secretary in the Reich Chancellery. She was young, presentable, and technically competent as a typist. What she almost certainly did not fully anticipate was the journey that application would take her on. She was selected from among several candidates to serve as one of Hitler's personal secretaries, and on January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's assumption of power, she typed the first document in her new role. Just a few weeks earlier, on February 2, 1943, she had married Hans Junge, an SS officer attached to Hitler's personal escort detail, taking his surname. The marriage was brief. Hans Junge was killed in action in Normandy in August 1944, leaving his young wife a widow, while still in the service of the man who had launched the very war that killed him. Traudl Junge's duties as one of Hitler's secretaries were demanding in the peculiar, irregular way that service to Hitler always was. Hitler was famously nocturnal, often working through the night and sleeping through the mornings. His secretaries kept pace with his rhythms, which meant late-night dictation sessions, irregular meal times, and long stretches of waiting punctuated by sudden bursts of intense activity. Junge recalled in her later accounts that she and the other secretaries would sometimes be summoned in the small hours of the morning to take dictation, only to find themselves sitting with Hitler afterward as he held court at the dinner table, talking endlessly about architecture, history, dogs, and the future of Germany. She described an atmosphere that was simultaneously tedious and surreal, a strange domestic routine conducted in the shadow of catastrophe. The document for which Traudl Junge is most famous is one she typed on the night of April 28th and into the early morning hours of April 29th, 1945, in the underground Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. With Soviet forces closing in on all sides, the city burning above them, and the Third Reich in its final death throes, Adolf Hitler dictated his personal will and his political testament to Junge. The political testament was a final statement of his beliefs, his justifications, and his hatreds. It blamed the Jews for the war, praised the German people, appointed a successor government, and expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the party for their perceived betrayals. Junge typed it all out as Hitler spoke. She later recalled that at the time she was so focused on the mechanical task of transcription that she did not fully absorb the content. It was not until afterwards, she said, that the full weight of what she had been part of began to settle on her. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun, whom he had married just hours earlier, died beside him having taken cyanide. Traudl Junge was in the bunker when it happened. In the chaos that followed, she and several others made an attempt to escape from the bunker through the city above. The escape was harrowing. Berlin was a battlefield, with Soviet soldiers fighting German holdouts street by street, building by building. Junge and her companions moved through the ruins, hiding, waiting, attempting to reach areas that might offer safety or a route out of the city. Some members of the group were captured. Some were killed. Junge herself managed to slip through the Soviet lines and eventually reach the western zones of Germany, where she was detained by American forces. The immediate post-war period for Traudl Junge was one of interrogation and displacement. She was questioned extensively by Allied intelligence officers who were eager to learn everything she knew about the events in the bunker in the final days. She answered their questions, providing testimony that would become an important historical record of those final hours. She was not charged with any crimes. Serving as a secretary, regardless of how close that role placed her to the centre of power, did not in itself constitute a prosecutable offence under the laws being applied at Nuremberg and in the Denazification proceedings that followed. After her release, she returned to civilian life in Germany and eventually found work as a journalist and editor in Munich. But if Traudl Junge's legal situation was uncomplicated, her psychological and moral situation was anything but. For decades after the war, she struggled with the question of her own culpability. She had not committed atrocities. She had not given orders. She had not known the full scope of the Holocaust while she served Hitler, or so she maintained. And yet she had sat across from the man responsible for it all. She had typed his words. She had eaten at his table. She had, in some meaningful sense, served him. How much responsibility does a person bear simply by virtue of proximity to evil? That question haunted her. In the 1960s and 1970s, Junge wrote a memoir about her experiences. For decades, however, she chose not to publish it. The reasons she gave were connected to her lingering sense of guilt and her uncertainty about whether the world was ready to receive such an account or whether she was ready to offer it. The memoir sat unpublished in manuscript form for years while she continued her quiet life in Munich, working as an editor for a magazine and generally keeping her past to herself except in private conversations and occasional interviews. The breakthrough in Junge's public engagement with her own history came in the late 1990s and early 2000s. She agreed to be interviewed extensively for a documentary film project, and those interviews became the basis for a film released in 2002 titled Blind Spot: Hitler's Secretary. In the documentary, an elderly Traudl Junge speaks with remarkable candour about her years in Hitler's service, her memories of the final days in the bunker, and her long struggle to come to terms with what she had been part of. The film was widely praised for its honesty and its willingness to sit with the moral complexity of Junge's position without either condemning her outright or offering her easy absolution. She was not a monster. She was not a hero. She was something more difficult than either. One of the most striking moments in the film came when Junge described walking past a memorial plaque in Munich that commemorated Sophie Scholl, the young student who had been executed for her role in the White Rose resistance movement. Sophie Scholl had been born in the same year as Traudl Junge, had grown up in the same Germany, had faced the same pressures and the same choices. And yet Scholl had resisted, had risked and given her life in opposition to the regime that Junge had served. The realization crystallized for Junge, she said, that youth and ignorance could not fully excuse her choices. There had been another path. She had simply not taken it. Traudl Junge lived long enough to see the final product of her interviews and her memoir. Her book, Until the Final Hour, Hitler's Last Secretary, was published in 2002, the same year as the documentary. She died on February 10th, 2002, in Munich of cancer, at the age of 81. The publication of her memoir and the release of the documentary were essentially simultaneous with her death, meaning she did not live to see the full reception of her work. But the impact was substantial. Her testimony became one of the foundational first-person sources for understanding the final weeks of the Hitler regime, and her willingness to confront her own moral failure, however late and imperfect that confrontation was, has made her one of the most discussed and debated figures in the complicated history of ordinary Germans under Nazism. In 2004, a major German-language film titled Der Untergang, or Downfall in English, depicted the final days in the Führer bunker. The film drew heavily on Traudl Junge's memoir and used her recollections as one of its primary sources. The actress Alexandra Maria Lara portrayed Junge in the film. Downfall became one of the most widely seen German-language films ever made, and introduced Traudl Junge's story to a new generation of viewers around the world who might otherwise never have encountered it. Christa Schroeder. If Traudl Junge has become the most famous of Hitler's secretaries in the years since the war, Christa Schroeder was in many respects the most significant during it. She served Hitler longer than any of his other personal secretaries, her tenure beginning in 1933, the very year he came to power, and continuing all the way to the final collapse in 1945. Across more than 12 years, she was present at an extraordinary range of moments in the history of the Third Reich. She typed his speeches before they were delivered. She transcribed his conversations. She accompanied him to the various headquarters he used during the war. She was in many ways as close an observer of Hitler the private man as any person alive. Born Emilie Anna Schroeder on March 19, 1908 in Saarbrücken, she went by the name Christa from early in her life. Her background was modest and unremarkable. She had worked as a secretary and stenographer before entering government service, and her skills in shorthand and rapid transcription were what brought her to the attention of the Nazi administration. She joined the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, in 1932, before Hitler had even come to power, suggesting that her association with the movement was not merely professional convenience, but reflected genuine political sympathy, at least at the outset of her career. Her 12-year proximity to Hitler gave Christa Schroeder an intimacy with his personality and habits that was, in some respects, unparalleled. She observed him in moments of exaltation, as during the fall of France in 1940, which produced in Hitler what observers described as a kind of ecstatic release after years of build-up toward what he saw as a historic reckoning with Germany's World War I defeat. She also observed him in moments of rage, of petulance, of self-pity, and of the strange withdrawn calm that sometimes settled over him after he had delivered himself of a particularly violent outburst. Schroeder later described a man who could be charming and almost paternal toward those close to him, while simultaneously harbouring the capacity for genocidal fury toward those he defined as enemies of Germany. During the war years, Schroeder accompanied Hitler to a series of field headquarters, including the Wolfschanze, or Wolfslair, in East Prussia, which served as his primary command post during the invasion of the Soviet Union and the long campaigns that followed. Life at these installations was characterized by isolation, strict security protocols, and the suffocating atmosphere that accumulated whenever Hitler's anxieties and frustrations were running high. Schroeder recalled the stifling nature of the headquarters' existence, the sense of being cut off from the wider world surrounded by the same faces, subject to the same routines, and increasingly aware as the years progressed that the great project to which she had devoted her professional life was heading toward catastrophe. The assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944, when a bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated in the briefing room at the Wolf's Lair, affected Schroeder as it did everyone in Hitler's immediate circle. Hitler survived the explosion with relatively minor injuries, but emerged from the experience with his suspicions and his sense of personal destiny, both dramatically intensified. The purge that followed, in which thousands of actual and suspected conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed, transformed the atmosphere of the headquarters into something even more paranoid and oppressive than it had already been. In the final months of the war, as the military situation became undeniably catastrophic, Christa Schroeder was among the secretaries who remained in Hitler's service. She was not, however, present in the bunker for the very final days. At some point in the spring of 1945, she was sent away from Berlin, along with other non-essential personnel, as the Soviet ring around the city tightened. This meant that, unlike Traudl Junge, she was not present for the dictation of the political testament or the final scenes underground. She made her way to Bavaria as Germany collapsed around her and was eventually captured by American forces. Her post-war experience was in some respects more prolonged and difficult than Junge's. Schroeder was held and interrogated for a significant period. She was not merely questioned briefly and released. American intelligence officers recognized that her 12 years at Hitler's side made her an extraordinarily valuable source of information about the private man, his methods, his relationships, and his psychology. She was subjected to detailed interviews over an extended period, and the transcripts of those interviews became important documents in the post-war historical record. Christa Schroeder was eventually released without being charged with any crime. The Denazification proceedings to which she was subjected resulted in her being classified under a category that essentially meant she was a fellow traveller rather than an active perpetrator of Nazi crimes. She had joined the party, yes. She had served the regime, undeniably. But the specific nature of her role as a secretary and typist, however senior and intimate her position, did not constitute the kind of active participation in atrocities that could be prosecuted. After her release, Schroeder returned to civilian life and settled in Munich, where she would spend the rest of her life. She was not inclined toward the kind of public self-examination that would come to characterize Traudl Junge's later life. She was by various accounts more guarded, more defensive, and more reluctant to acknowledge any personal responsibility for the events she had witnessed and assisted. When she did speak about her years in Hitler's service, she tended to portray herself as a professional employee who had done her job competently and who bore no particular guilt for the choices of the man she worked for. In the 1980s, Schroeder worked with a historian named Anton Joachim Stahler to compile her recollections of her years in Hitler's service. The resulting book, war mein Chef, or He Was My Chief, was published in German in 1985. The title, alone is telling. Not He Was My Führer, not He Was a Monster, not I Served Evil. He Was My Chief. The framing is resolutely professional, positioning the memoir not as a moral reckoning but as the recollections of an employee about a notable employer. Critics and historians noted this framing with some skepticism, pointing out that it represented a deflection of the deeper questions that Schroeder's 12 years in Hitler's service inevitably raised. The book nonetheless contained considerable historical value, offering details about Hitler's daily habits, his dietary preferences, his relationship with his inner circle, and his behavior during key moments of the war that could not be obtained from official documents. Schroeder recalled Hitler's peculiarities with some precision, including his obsession with cleanliness, his strange dietary regimen of vegetarian dishes prepared according to his exacting specifications, his deep hatred of cigarette smoke, which meant that smoking was strictly forbidden in his presence, and his tendency to monologue at extraordinary length on subjects that interested him while his secretaries and other staff sat listening, often for hours on end. Christa Schroeder lived until May 28, 1984, dying in Munich at the age of 76. She never fully engaged with the broader moral questions raised by her service to Hitler in the way that some others who had been close to the regime eventually would. Her memoir stands as a useful historical document, but also as a testament to the human capacity to frame one's involvement in catastrophic events in ways that minimize personal responsibility. She was Hitler's longest-serving secretary, and she carried that fact with her to the end of her life, without, it seems, allowing it to trouble her as deeply as it troubled those who studied her from the outside. Johanna Wolf. Among Hitler's inner circle of personal secretaries, Johanna Wolf holds a particular distinction. She was the oldest of the group and in many respects the most deeply embedded in the personal mythology of the Nazi leader. Born on March 1, 1900 in Munich, she came from a background that placed her in the early milieu from which the Nazi movement had emerged. She had been acquainted with figures in the early Nazi circle from its formation in the early 1920s. and she entered Hitler's personal service before he had even achieved national political prominence. Johanna Wolf began working as Hitler's secretary in the early 1930s and continued in that role through the entire duration of his chancellorship and the war. Like Christa Schroeder, she was a figure of remarkable continuity in a regime that consumed and destroyed people with brutal efficiency. That she survived the entire period without falling from favour speaks to her discretion, her competence, and her willingness to subordinate herself entirely to the requirements of the role. Wolf's personal background included a degree of ideological commitment that went beyond mere professional convenience. She was a true believer in the Nazi cause, at least in the years of the movement's rise, and her loyalty to Hitler was personal as well as institutional. Those who knew her recalled her as intensely devoted, protective of Hitler's privacy and reputation, and deeply suspicious of anyone she considered a potential threat to his interests or reputation. In the enclosed world of the Führer bunker and the various field headquarters, personal secretaries like Wolf wielded an informal power that came not from any official authority, but from their physical proximity to the center of power. To pass a message to Hitler, to secure an audience, to place a document in front of him at the right moment, these things required the cooperation of the people around him, and Wolf was one of those people. During the war, Johanna Wolf was present at many of the critical moments that occurred in the various headquarters installations. She worked through the triumphant early years of German expansion, through the turning of the tide at Stalingrad and Kursk, and through the long, grinding catastrophe of the war's final phase. Like Christa Schroeder, she was eventually sent away from Berlin in the final weeks before the Soviet encirclement of the city became complete. She was not among those who went through the experience of the final days in the bunker. At the war's end, Wolf was captured by American forces along with other members of Hitler's former household staff. She was interrogated and held for a period before eventually being released after denazification proceedings. She returned to private life in Germany and maintained an extraordinarily low profile in the decades that followed. Unlike Schroeder, she did not produce a memoir. Unlike Junge, she did not agree to extensive interviews or public appearances. She withdrew almost entirely from any public engagement with her past. The silence Johanna Wolf maintained for the rest of her life has made her in some ways the most opaque of Hitler's secretaries. Historians have had to rely on the accounts of others, the official records of her interrogation, and the occasional fragmentary reference to piece together what she remembered and believed. What is clear is that she did not seek rehabilitation, did not seek vindication, and did not seek to explain herself. She simply disappeared into private life and stayed there. She died on June 5, 1985 in Munich, at the age of 85, having outlived most of the others who had surrounded Hitler and having said almost nothing publicly about what she had witnessed. The silence of Johanna Wolf stands in stark contrast to the voluminous testimony produced by Traudl Junge and the published memoir of Christa Schroeder. It raises questions that cannot be definitively answered. Did she keep silent because she had something to hide? Because she was consumed by guilt that she could not articulate? Because she believed the past was better left undisturbed? Because she was simply a private person who had no desire for the attention that public statements would have brought? All of these explanations have been offered by historians, and none can be definitively ruled out. Gerda Christian born Gerda Daranowski on December 13, 1913 in Berlin. The woman who would become one of Hitler's personal secretaries grew up in the capital of the Weimar Republic and came of age as the Nazi movement was transforming Germany. She joined the staff of the Reich Chancellery in 1937 and began working as one of Hitler's personal secretaries. In 1943, she married Gerda Christian, a Luftwaffe general who would later serve as Hitler's liaison officer with the Air Force, taking his surname. Gerda Christian was therefore not merely a secretary to Hitler, but was personally connected through her marriage to the upper reaches of the German military establishment. Gerda Christian's years in Hitler's service overlapped significantly with those of both Christa Schroeder and Traudl Junge, and the three women formed part of the small, tight-knit group of female staff who inhabited the strange artificial world of the Führer Hauptquartier. Junge's later memoir and interviews described Gerda Christian as a colleague rather than a close friend, a professional presence who took her work seriously and who, like the others, inhabited the peculiar twilight zone between proximity to absolute power and the mundane routines of office work. What distinguished Gerda Christian from some of the others was that she was present in the Führer bunker during the final days. remaining in Berlin after many others had been evacuated. She was there on April 29, 1945, when Hitler married Eva Braun and then dictated his testament to Traudl Junge. She was present on April 30th when Hitler and Braun died, and she was among the group that attempted to break out of the bunker and escape from the Soviet encirclement of Berlin in the days immediately following Hitler's death. The breakout attempt was one of the more extraordinary episodes associated with any of Hitler's surviving secretaries. A group of several dozen people, including Gerda Christian, Traudl Junge, Martin Bormann, and various military officers and staff members, attempted to move through the ruins of Berlin under cover of darkness on the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945. The group quickly fragmented under the chaos and violence of the street fighting. Some were killed, some were captured, some managed to escape. Christian succeeded in getting out of the Soviet-controlled zone and eventually made her way to Western Germany. After the war, Gerda Christian was interrogated by Allied forces and released without being charged. She returned to civilian life in Germany, settled in Düsseldorf, and worked for a time in the fashion industry. Like Johanna Wolf, she largely maintained a low profile for the rest of her life, giving few interviews and making little attempt to engage publicly with her. Wartime passed. She did participate in some historical research projects over the years, providing recollections that contributed to the scholarly literature on the Nazi period, but she was not a public figure and did not seek to become one. Her marriage to Eckhard Christian ended in divorce. In the post-war years, she remarried. She lived quietly into old age and died on April 3, 1997, in Düsseldorf at the age of 83. Her death attracted relatively little attention outside of specialized historical circles, which is perhaps appropriate for a woman who had spent most of her adult life trying to attract as little attention as possible. The question of what Gerda Christian knew, what she thought, and what she felt about her years of service to Hitler is one that has never been fully answered. She was too close to the events, too embedded in the world of the Führer bunker to have been entirely ignorant of the nature of the regime she served, and yet the specific question of individual moral awareness and responsibility is one that resists easy resolution, in her case as in the cases of all the secretaries. They were women in a patriarchal system, employed in a professional capacity, operating within a structure of authority that demanded conformity and punished deviation. These facts do not absolve them of responsibility, but they do complicate the moral ledger in ways that historians have continued to debate. Rochus Misch and the wider bunker world. Before we continue with the other secretaries and the women who orbited the inner circle of the Führer bunker, it is worth pausing to consider the broader context in which these women worked and the cast of characters who surrounded them. The bunker world of the final weeks was extraordinarily compressed, both physically and psychologically. The people present during those final days were not there by accident. They had chosen at some level to remain. And the question of why they stayed when others had fled or been sent away says something important about each of them. The secretaries who remained in Berlin through to the end did so in part because leaving felt like a form of desertion, and the culture of the Nazi inner circle made desertion unthinkable. They had also, over years of service, formed attachments to the routines and the relationships of that world that made separation difficult to imagine. And for some of them, there may have been a simpler and more human explanation. They were afraid of what lay outside. The war was ending. Germany was defeated. The world was uncertain and frightening. The bunker, for all its horror, was at least familiar. Among the other women who inhabited the inner circle of the bunker world, two deserve particular attention here. The first is Eva Braun, who of course was not a secretary, but whose presence shaped the emotional atmosphere of Hitler's household throughout the war years. The second is Marga Bormann, the wife of Martin Bormann, who was not in the bunker herself, but whose fate illustrates the broader pattern of what happened to the women connected to the Nazi leadership. But our focus must return to the secretaries and to those whose stories have not yet been fully told. Elisabeth Kalhammer. Less famous than Junge or Schroeder, Elisabeth Kalhammer was nonetheless part of the broader circle of secretarial and administrative staff who served in Hitler's household during the final years of the war. She was one of the typists and clerical workers who handled the overflow of correspondence and documents that even a diminishing empire continued to generate. The precise details of her wartime service are less thoroughly documented than those of the more senior secretaries, but she was present at the Wolf's Lair and at other headquarters installations during her period of service. Kalhammer's post-war fate was the relatively common one for women in similar positions. She was interrogated by Allied authorities, cleared of criminal charges, and returned to private life in Germany. The Denazification process that swept through post-war German society was designed to assess the degree of complicity of each individual in the crimes of the Nazi regime. And the secretaries generally emerged from this process with minimal penalties, precisely because their role was understood to be functional rather than ideological or directly criminal. This outcome satisfied many contemporary observers and has frustrated historians and moralists ever since. The question of whether typing a genocidal dictator's correspondence makes you complicit in genocide is not one that the denazification tribunals were equipped or inclined to answer definitively, and it remains genuinely contested. The case of Kalhammer and others like her also raises broader questions about gender and culpability in the Nazi system. Women in Nazi Germany occupied a particular position within the ideological framework of the regime. National Socialism's official ideology was deeply patriarchal, assigning women primarily to the roles of wife, mother, and homemaker. Women were largely excluded from positions of formal political power, and yet in practice, women like the secretaries occupied positions of considerable informal influence precisely because of their proximity to the men who did hold power. This paradox has made the history of women in the Nazi system one of the more complex and contested areas of Holocaust and Second World War scholarship. Gerda Christian, another member of Hitler's secretarial staff whose name appears in the historical record, is Gerda Christian. Like Kalhammer, she served in a capacity that placed her within the administrative machinery of Hitler's household without rising to the prominence of the most senior secretaries. The records of her service are fragmentary, pieced together from the interrogation transcripts and organizational documents that survive from the Nazi bureaucracy. What is clear from the available evidence is that Christian, like the others in similar positions, emerged from the war without criminal prosecution and returned to civilian life. The denazification proceedings placed her in a category that acknowledged her connection to the Nazi system, while declining to treat that connection as a criminal matter. She maintained an extremely low profile after the war, and detailed information about her post-war life and eventual fate is difficult to establish with confidence from the public record. The fragmentary nature of the historical record for some of the less prominent secretaries is itself historically significant. The major figures of the Nazi regime, the generals, the ministers, the party leaders, are extensively documented. The people who served them in support roles are often much harder to trace. This reflects both the priorities of the post-war investigators, who were naturally focused on those who had exercised formal power, and the fact that many of these individuals made active choices to disappear from public life as thoroughly as they could. The question of knowledge. One of the central issues in assessing the historical responsibility of Hitler's secretaries is the question of what they knew about the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities. This question is significantly more complex than it might initially appear, and the various secretaries gave varying answers to it when they were asked in the post-war period. Traudl Junge's public statements on this subject evolved considerably over time. In the immediate post-war period, she maintained that she had been largely ignorant of the extermination camps and the systematic murder of Jews and others. She had been too young, too preoccupied with her immediate duties, too isolated within the bubble of the Führer Hauptquartier to have known the full truth of what the regime was doing. This was not implausible on its face. The physical isolation of the field headquarters was real, and the deliberate secrecy maintained around the final solution meant that detailed information about the death camps was not freely circulated even within the senior reaches of the regime. However, as Junge herself eventually acknowledged, ignorance is not entirely exculpatory. The regime's anti-Semitism was public and explicit from the very beginning. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, the mass deportations of Jews from across occupied Europe, these were not secrets. The language Hitler used in his speeches and in private conversations, language that Junge heard and transcribed repeatedly, made his intentions toward the Jewish people unmistakably clear long before the details of the final solution became known. The question of whether a person working at Hitler's right hand could have remained innocent of the general thrust of what the regime was doing requires considerable credulity to sustain. Christa Schroeder's account of her own knowledge was even more guarded than Junge's. Her memoir and her interviews gave relatively little attention to the broader moral questions raised by her service, focusing instead on the more manageable territory of Hitler's personal habits and the internal politics of his household. She never offered the kind of explicit moral reckoning that Junge eventually attempted. Whether this was because she had nothing to reckon with, because she lacked the psychological capacity or inclination for such reckoning, or because she knew more than she was willing to say, cannot be determined from the available evidence. The matter of the stenographic records is particularly interesting in this context. Hitler held regular military briefings, especially during the war, in which the progress and conduct of military campaigns were discussed in detail. Some of these briefings were transcribed by stenographers, producing an important documentary record. The secretaries were not always present at these briefings, but when they were, they had access to information about military operations, including operations on the Eastern Front, where the murder of Jews and Soviet civilians was carried out on an enormous scale. Whether the secretaries who sat in on or transcribed such briefings absorbed and retained the moral significance of what they heard is impossible to know with certainty. Albert Bormann's role and the administrative network. While the focus of this discussion is specifically on Hitler's personal secretaries, it is useful to note that they operated within a much larger administrative network that helped keep the Nazi government functioning. The Reich Chancellery was a complex bureaucracy with hundreds of employees. Martin Bormann, as head of the party chancellery and then as Hitler's personal secretary from 1943 onward, was in many respects the most powerful administrator in the system, controlling access to Hitler more completely than anyone else. The relationship between Bormann and the female secretaries was professionally correct but not always comfortable, and several of the secretaries left accounts suggesting that they found Bormann an oppressive and controlling presence. Hitler's relationship with his secretaries was also shaped by Eva Braun's presence in his life. Braun and the secretaries shared a common existence at the Berghof, the Alpine retreat near Berchtesgaden, and at the various headquarters installations where they all spent much of the war. Braun and the secretaries got along reasonably well in the accounts that survive. They shared the tedium of the headquarters' existence, the social isolation, and the peculiar status of women in the inner circle who were simultaneously privileged and powerless. The Berghof years. For a fuller understanding of the secretary's experience, it is necessary to consider not only the war years but also the pre-war period at the Berghof, Hitler's residence on the Obersalzberg above Berchtesgaden in Bavaria. This was the setting that shaped the culture of Hitler's household and established the patterns of deference, loyalty, and institutional conformity that would persist through the war. The Berghof was both a residence and a power centre, visited by foreign leaders, German officials, and Nazi luminaries. The secretaries who worked there inhabited a world of genuine material privilege. The setting was beautiful, the food was good, the social circle was select. And this is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of the secretaries' story. Their service to Hitler was not a burden, at least not in material terms for most of the years of the regime's existence. It was, in many respects, a privilege. They had access to one of the most powerful men in the world. They enjoyed the comfort of his various residences. They were treated with the respect that proximity to power confers. The discomfort, the fear, the isolation, the moral horror, these things accumulated gradually and became undeniable only as the war turned against Germany, and the reality of what the regime had done could no longer be deflected. By that point, they were too deeply embedded to leave, even if they had wanted to. Heinz Linger and the household staff. The secretaries did not work in isolation. They were part of a broader household that included Hitler's personal valet Heinz Linger, his adjutants, his doctors, his liaison officers, and a range of other personal staff. Ling in particular occupies an interesting place in the historical record because, like the secretaries, he was an intimate observer of Hitler's daily existence who survived the war and eventually spoke and wrote about what he had seen. His memoir, With Hitler to the End, published posthumously, offers a perspective on the inner workings of Hitler's household that in some ways complements and in some ways contradicts the accounts given by the secretaries. The relationship between these various household staff members was, by all accounts, complex. The enclosed world of the headquarters bred intense personal relationships, rivalries, loyalties, and resentments. Who had access to Hitler's ear, who could get documents in front of him, who was trusted, and who was suspected, these things mattered enormously in a system that was entirely organized around the will and the attention of one man. The secretaries, by virtue of their regular daily contact with Hitler, had a kind of quiet influence that others in the household were aware of and sometimes sought to use. Several of the secretaries described Hitler's behavior toward them as paternal rather than sexually predatory, though this interpretation has been questioned by some historians. Hitler was known to have insisted on a degree of formality in his relationships with the women around him, at least in the presence of others, and the secretaries generally described their relationship with him as professional and respectful, if highly asymmetrical. He sometimes gave them gifts, chocolates and flowers on their birthdays, and he occasionally asked about their personal lives. He was, in the accounts they gave, more human in private than his public persona suggested, though this observation always has to be read in the context of what that private man was simultaneously ordering to happen to millions of people outside the walls of his residences. Rochus Misch's testimony. No account of the bunker world and the people who inhabited it would be complete without reference to Rochus Misch, who served as Hitler's telephone operator and bodyguard, and who was the last surviving witness of the events in the Führer bunker, dying in 2013 at the age of 96. Misch's testimony about the final days in the bunker, including his recollections of the secretaries who were present there, adds an important dimension to our understanding of what those final days were like. Misch described Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian as professional and composed during the final chaos, maintaining their duties even as the situation became clearly hopeless. He recalled the surreal atmosphere of the bunker, where people continued their routines, eating meals, attending briefings, doing paperwork, as the Soviet artillery grew closer and the sounds of urban warfare became a constant backdrop. The human capacity to continue functioning in the face of obvious catastrophe, to maintain the routines of normalcy, even when normalcy has been utterly destroyed, is one of the more disturbing themes that runs through the testimonies of the bunker survivors. Misch himself maintained a stance similar to Christa Schroeder's in his post-war recollections, presenting himself primarily as a professional who had done his job and who bore no particular responsibility for what the man he served had done. His longevity made him a recurring presence in historical documentaries about the Nazi period right up until his death, and his willingness to speak about the technical and operational details of his work in the bunker coexisted with a consistent resistance to engaging with the deeper moral questions his service raised. The Denazification process. The formal process by which all of Hitler's surviving secretaries were assessed after the war was the Denazification program administered by the Allied occupation authorities. This program, which applied to virtually all Germans who had worked for or with the Nazi regime, was designed to categorize individuals according to their level of involvement and to assign appropriate penalties or restrictions. The categories ranged from major offenders who faced imprisonment or other serious consequences through lesser offenders, followers, and those who were exonerated. The secretaries were almost universally placed in the lower categories, typically as followers, people who had been part of the Nazi system without being among its active perpetrators. This categorization reflected both the legal and practical realities of their situations. They had not issued orders. They had not commanded troops. They had not been present when atrocities were committed. The specific nature of secretarial work, whatever the context in which it was performed, did not fit the definitions of war crimes or crimes against humanity that were being applied in the post-war judicial proceedings. This outcome was controversial at the time and has remained controversial ever since. Critics argued that the denazification process was too lenient, that it allowed too many people to escape accountability by hiding behind the defense of merely following orders or merely doing their jobs. Defenders of the process pointed out that you cannot try an entire nation, that some system of graduated accountability was necessary, and that the resources of the occupation authorities were necessarily focused on those with the most direct responsibility for the most serious crimes. The question of whether the secretaries should have faced more serious consequences is one that has no simple answer. They were not innocent. They served a genocidal regime and contributed to its functioning. But the degree to which their specific contributions were morally equivalent to the contributions of those who designed and implemented the mass murders is a question that reasonable people have continued to disagree about. What seems clear is that the denazification process, whatever its merits and failings as a system of justice, effectively ended the formal accountability proceedings for the secretaries and left them free to construct their post-war lives as best they could. The later lives of the secretaries. What did a woman do with herself after she had spent years at the side of history's most destructive dictator? The answers varied considerably depending on the individual, but some common patterns emerged from the lives of Hitler's secretaries in the decades after 1945. For most of them, the immediate priority was simple survival. Post-war Germany was a devastated, hungry, and chaotic place. The infrastructure of daily life had been shattered, cities were rubble, supply chains had collapsed, millions of people were displaced. The task of finding food, shelter, and employment was urgent and immediate, and it left little room for philosophical reflection or public engagement with the past. The secretaries, like millions of other Germans, got on with the business of rebuilding their lives in a country that had been fundamentally destroyed. Traudl Junge found work relatively quickly after her release from Allied custody. Her skills as a typist and editor were marketable, and Munich, where she settled, was a city with an active publishing and media industry, even in the difficult post-war years. She worked for the magazine Quick as an editor for many years, a job that was in some respects a direct continuation of the skills she had developed during the war, working with words and documents, shaping text for publication. The irony of a former Nazi dictator's secretary working as a magazine editor in the new democratic West Germany was not lost on observers, though it was not particularly commented upon at the time. Post-war German society had a powerful collective interest in not looking too closely at the recent pasts of people who were now functioning, productive members of the new order. Christa Schroeder's post-war trajectory was similar in its broad outlines. She settled in Munich, found work in the civilian economy, and lived modestly for the rest of her life. Her long years of service to Hitler had given her no transferable credentials that could be openly acknowledged, and she had to rebuild her professional identity on other foundations. Unlike Junge, she did not work in journalism or media. She kept a lower profile, maintaining the guardedness that had characterized her post-war stance from the beginning. Gerda Christian's move to Düsseldorf and her work in the fashion industry represents an interesting case of professional reinvention. The fashion world of post-war West Germany was in the process of rebuilding itself, and someone with Gerda Christian's organizational skills and her years of experience managing the complex logistics of a major headquarters could find a useful niche in that kind of environment. She was divorced from her Luftwaffe general husband, a man whose own post-war fate involved the standard process of denazification and professional rehabilitation that characterized many former Wehrmacht officers in the new West Germany. The question of remarriage and family life in the post-war years is one that touches on the secretaries' experiences in ways that reveal the broader social pressures they faced. Traudl Junge, widowed at 24, did not remarry. She spoke in her later interviews of the difficulty of forming close personal relationships in the aftermath of her wartime experiences, the way in which those years created a kind of emotional distance that made ordinary intimacy difficult. The trauma of the bunker, the loss of her husband, the moral weight of her service, all of these things contributed to a post-war inner life that was complex and often painful. Christa Schroeder also did not marry, or if she did, the fact is not well established in the public record. Her life appears to have been primarily shaped by her work and by her long effort to manage her public image and her historical legacy. The writing of her memoir in the 1980s, when she was already in her 70s, can be seen as a final attempt to exercise control over how she would be remembered, to set the terms on which her story would be told. The psychological burden. Several of the secretaries, particularly Traudl Junge, spoke in their later years about the psychological burden they carried from their wartime service. The concept of what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress was not well understood or widely acknowledged in the immediate post-war period. People were expected to recover, to move on, to put the past behind them and contribute to the construction of the new Germany. The massive collective trauma of the war was addressed primarily through silence and suppression, rather than through the kind of public acknowledgement and processing that would come later. Junge described periods in her post-war life when she struggled with depression and with recurring memories and dreams about the bunker. The specific images that haunted her included the moment of Hitler's death and the chaotic escape attempt through the ruins of Berlin. She described the experience of working as an editor on mundane magazine content while carrying the memory of typing Hitler's final words as a kind of cognitive dissonance that never fully resolved. How do you sit at a typewriter in a normal office in post-war Munich and not think about the last time you sat at a typewriter in an underground bunker taking dictation from Adolf Hitler? The psychological literature on perpetrators and bystanders in the Nazi system, a field that has grown enormously since the 1960s, offers some frameworks for understanding what the secretaries may have experienced. The concept of moral disengagement, the psychological mechanisms by which ordinary people are able to participate in or enable extraordinary evil without experiencing it as such, is relevant here. The secretaries were not people who had decided to support genocide. They were people who had taken jobs, done their work, followed the rules of the institution they served, and found themselves, step by step, embedded in the machinery of one of the worst crimes in human history. The gradual, incremental nature of that embedding is what made it both possible and difficult to fully comprehend. Junge's most powerful insight, the one she articulated most forcefully in her documentary interview, was that the question was not whether she had known about the Holocaust in its full details while she served Hitler, but whether she had asked the questions that would have led her to know. She had not asked. She had accepted what she was told, accepted the version of events she was presented with, and had not pressed for information that might have disturbed the comfortable routine of her existence. That failure to ask, to know, to see, she eventually came to regard as its own kind of moral failure, distinct from but related to the active crimes of those who designed and implemented the killing. The memoirs and their reception. The three major first-person accounts produced by Hitler's secretaries, Junge's Until the Final Hour, Schroeder's war mein Chef, and the extensive interrogation transcripts that serve as a de facto memoir for the less publicly communicative Johanna Wolf, have been received by historians and the general public in ways that reveal much about how German and international society has grappled with the moral complexities of the Nazi period. Schroeder's book, published in 1985, appeared during a period when Germany was still in the process of working through what historians would later call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the processing and coming to terms with the Nazi past. The book was received with interest in historical circles for its factual content about Hitler's personal habits and inner circle dynamics, but it attracted criticism for its emotional detachment and its reluctance to engage with the broader moral dimensions of what Schroeder had witnessed and participated in. German reviewers in particular noted that the book's resolutely professional framing felt like a missed opportunity, or worse, a form of continued evasion. Junge's memoir and documentary, by contrast, appeared at a moment when German society was significantly more prepared to engage with personal accounts of the Nazi period that included genuine moral complexity and self-examination. The year 2002, when both works were released, was nearly 6 decades after the end of the war. The generation that had lived through the Nazi period as adults was dying out. The children and grandchildren of that generation were asking harder questions. The cultural moment was right for an account that did not simply provide factual information, but also grappled with the personal dimension of what it meant to have served Hitler. The international reception of Junge's memoir and documentary was also significant. In countries outside Germany, particularly in the English-speaking world, there was considerable interest in first-person accounts of life in Hitler's inner circle. Accounts that could make the machinery of the Third Reich feel human scale rather than abstractly monstrous. Junge's testimony served this purpose. It showed a Hitler who was in many respects ordinary, tedious, even boring in his private moments, while never losing sight of the colossal evil of which he was the author. This combination, the ordinary man and the extraordinary monster, is one of the most disturbing and important truths that the testimonies of the secretaries helped to establish. The Downfall film and its legacy. The release of the German film Downfall in 2004, directed by Oliver Hirschbiegel and starring Bruno Ganz as Adolf Hitler and Alexandra Maria Lara as Traudl Junge, represented a cultural watershed in the way the Nazi period was depicted on screen. The film drew directly on Junge's memoir as one of its primary sources and framed the entire narrative through her perspective, opening and closing with footage of the real Traudl Junge speaking to camera in what appeared to be the documentary interview that had been filmed before her death. The film was controversial for reasons that are instructive about how the representation of Nazism in fiction and drama is policed by historical and moral guardians in Germany and elsewhere. The central controversy revolved around the film's decision to portray Hitler as a human being, to show him expressing tenderness toward his dog, gratitude toward his secretaries, and a kind of bitter pathos as his world collapsed around him. Critics argued that this humanization was dangerous, that it risked generating sympathy for Hitler in ways that were morally and historically irresponsible. Supporters of the film, and they were numerous, argued the opposite. They contended that refusing to portray Hitler as human was itself a form of historical falsification, one that paradoxically made the Holocaust harder to understand by placing its perpetrators outside the range of normal human psychology. If Hitler was simply a monster from birth, incomprehensibly evil in ways that no ordinary person could be, then the question of how ordinary Germans supported and enabled him becomes unanswerable. If he was a human being, capable of both charm and mass murder, then the question becomes both more disturbing and more historically meaningful. Traudl Junge's testimony was central to this debate precisely because she had seen the human Hitler, the man who was kind to his dogs, who gave chocolates to his secretaries, who laughed at dinner table jokes. Her account made it impossible to claim that those who served him must have known at all times that they were serving a monster, because for much of the time, in the immediate personal environment of his household, he did not present himself as one. He presented himself as a patriotic leader, a visionary, a man devoted to Germany's future. The horror of what was done in his name was happening elsewhere, in places the secretaries were not, to people. They were not meeting, on a scale that required deliberate effort not to confront. This is not exculpation, it is explanation. And the distinction matters. The wider circle beyond the four principal secretaries discussed here, there were other women who performed secretarial and administrative functions in the broader Nazi government, and who shared some aspects of the experience described above, even if they did not occupy quite the same intimate position in Hitler's household. The various Nazi ministries and military commands employed hundreds of female secretaries and clerks. The Foreign Office, the Reich Security Main Office, the Ministry of Propaganda, all these institutions had female administrative staff who were in some sense part of the machinery that made the Nazi system function. Many of these women faced the same basic post-war experience as Hitler's personal secretaries. They were processed through the Denazification system, placed in the follower or exonerated categories in most cases, and returned to civilian life. Some went on to long and apparently unremarkable post-war careers. Others struggled, as Junge did, with the psychological weight of what they had witnessed and participated in. A few eventually spoke publicly about their experiences. Most did not. The fate of female Nazi secretaries and clerks who worked in the occupied territories, particularly in the East where the Holocaust was being implemented, is a more complicated and, in some cases, darker story. Women who served as secretaries and administrators in the SS headquarters in Poland, in the Reich Security Main Office's regional offices, or in the administrative apparatus of the death camps, were in some cases in much closer proximity to the actual machinery of murder than the secretaries in Hitler's personal household. Some of these women have been studied by historians, and the picture that emerges is one of women who were in many cases direct witnesses to mass killings, and who continued to perform their administrative functions regardless. The historian Wendy Lower's research, particularly her book Hitler's Furies, published in 2013, examined the role of German women in the occupied East and found evidence of female participation in Nazi atrocities that went far beyond the passive secretarial role that has sometimes been assumed. While this broader history is beyond the scope of our focus on Hitler's personal secretaries specifically, it is an important context for understanding that the secretary's story is not an isolated one, but part of a much larger pattern of female complicity in the Nazi system. The interrogation records. One of the most valuable historical resources that the post-war treatment of Hitler's secretaries has left us is the interrogation transcripts produced by Allied intelligence officers in the months following Germany's defeat. These documents, many of which were classified for years and have only been fully accessible to researchers in more recent decades, provide a window into what the secretaries chose to say and what they chose not to say in the immediate aftermath of the regime's collapse. The interrogations were conducted primarily by American intelligence officers, though British and French interrogators were also involved in some cases. The goal was partly judicial, gathering evidence for the various trials that were being planned, and partly historical, building a documentary record of the regime that had just been destroyed. The intelligence services recognized that the women who had sat at Hitler's side for years possessed information that could not be obtained from captured documents or from the testimony of military commanders. They knew the private Hitler, the man behind the decisions, and they had potentially heard things that were never written down. The transcripts reveal a consistent pattern in how the secretaries approached these interrogations. They were cooperative in providing factual information about Hitler's daily routines, his physical appearance and demeanor, his relationships with the principal figures of the regime, and the events they had personally witnessed. They were significantly more guarded when questions moved toward matters that might implicate them or others in specific crimes. They acknowledged the general outlines of the regime's anti-Semitism while maintaining that they had not known the specific details of the extermination program. This pattern is historically significant, not because it necessarily reveals deliberate deception, though it may have in some cases, but because it reveals the psychological and practical logic that governed how survivors of the Nazi inner circle chose to present themselves to the post-war world. The line they drew was between serving Hitler, which they acknowledged, and knowing about or supporting mass murder, which they denied or minimized. Whether that line accurately reflected their actual knowledge and awareness is a question that the interrogation transcripts cannot definitively answer. Some of the interrogation material contains details that are not found anywhere in the published memoirs or documentary interviews. These details, often small and seemingly incidental, sometimes cast a different light on the events the secretaries described in their public accounts. Discrepancies between what was said in interrogation and what was said in later memoirs have been noted by historians and have contributed to an ongoing debate about the reliability of the secretaries' self-accounts. The secretaries and the Holocaust. The question of what Hitler's secretaries knew about the Holocaust is inextricably connected to a broader historical debate about what ordinary Germans knew about it, and this context is essential to understanding their post-war claims of ignorance. The evidence accumulated by historians since the war has made it increasingly difficult to sustain the argument that average Germans were truly unaware of the systematic murder of the Jews. The deportations were visible. The trains carrying Jews eastward passed through German cities and towns. The absence of the Jewish communities that had been deported was observable by anyone who cared to look. The soldiers and SS personnel who participated in the mass shootings on the Eastern Front returned home on leave, and in many cases talked about what they had seen and done. For the secretaries specifically, the claim of ignorance is even harder to sustain than it might be for an ordinary German who had no special access to the regime's inner workings. They worked with people. Adolf Hitler, Martin Bormann, Heinrich Himmler when he visited, who had direct knowledge of and responsibility for the Holocaust. They typed documents, they overheard conversations, they attended briefings. The specific claim that none of this ever brought them into proximity with information about the extermination program is one that historians have found difficult to accept at face value. At the same time, it is important to distinguish between different types and levels of knowledge. Knowing that Jews were being deported and killed in the East is different from knowing the specific details of the industrialized murder system, the camps, the gas chambers, the precise mechanisms of the final solution. The secretaries may genuinely not have had detailed knowledge of the latter while having had general awareness of the former, and the psychological mechanisms of denial and compartmentalization are well established. It is entirely possible to know something at one level of consciousness while refusing to integrate that knowledge at another level, to see without seeing, to hear without absorbing. Traudl Junge's most honest and painful public statement about her relationship to the Holocaust came in the Blind Spot documentary. When she described her reaction to learning the full details of the extermination program after the war, she said that her first response was disbelief. Not because she thought the Allies were lying, but because even she, who had sat in the same room as the man responsible for it all, hadn't fully allowed herself to understand what was happening. This statement is simultaneously credible and disturbing. It speaks to the power of denial and ideological conditioning to insulate a person from moral reality even when that reality is unfolding all around them. Otto Günsche and the household veterans. It would be incomplete to discuss Hitler's personal staff without reference to Otto Günsche, his personal adjutant and SS officer, who was present in the bunker through to the very end, and who, following Hitler's death, carried out the specific task of burning Hitler's and Eva Braun's bodies in the Reich Chancellery garden, according to Hitler's explicit instructions. Günsche's post-war fate was dramatically different from that of the Secretaries. He was captured by Soviet forces, not American or British forces, and this distinction proved enormously consequential. Günsche spent the years from 1945 to 1956 in Soviet captivity, initially undergoing intensive interrogation by Soviet intelligence officers, who were determined to extract every possible detail about Hitler's final days, and later being held in various Soviet prison camps. The Soviets were deeply interested in verifiable proof that Hitler was genuinely dead, since there were early rumors and persistent suspicions that he might have escaped. Günsche was able to provide testimony about the suicide and the burning of the bodies that, combined with other evidence, eventually satisfied the Soviets on this point. When Günsche was finally returned to West Germany in 1956, he found a country that had changed dramatically from the one he had served. West Germany was by then a functioning democratic state, integrated into the Western Alliance and engaged in the process of economic recovery. Former members of the Nazi government and military were being reintegrated into society through a combination of formal denazification and informal social amnesia. Günsche settled in West Germany, was denazified, and eventually returned to civilian life. His case illustrates one of the sharp distinctions in post-war fate that affected people who had served in Hitler's immediate circle, depending on which Allied power captured them. Those captured by Americans, British, or French forces faced the denazification process, which was often relatively lenient for people who had not committed specific war crimes. Those captured by the Soviets faced a very different fate. The Soviet Union had no interest in the niceties of Western legal process. They were primarily interested in extracting intelligence and, in some cases, in extracting revenge. Soviet captivity for former senior Nazi officials could mean years of imprisonment, interrogation, hard labor, and, in some cases, death. The Secretaries' fate of being captured by Western rather than Soviet forces was therefore not incidental to how their post-war lives unfolded. Had Traudl Junge or Christa Schroeder been caught by Soviet troops rather than American forces, their post-war experience would almost certainly have been far more prolonged and brutal. The geography of Germany's collapse, the direction from which the various Allied armies advanced, determined which survivors ended up in which jurisdictions, and that determination had profound consequences for individual lives. Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer, offers another useful comparison point. Bauer was among those captured by the Soviets and spent 10 years in Soviet captivity before being returned to West Germany in 1955. During his captivity, he was repeatedly interrogated about the final days in the bunker and about the possibility of Hitler's escape, since the Soviets remained uncertain for years about whether the remains they had found in the Reich Chancellery garden were genuinely Hitler's. Bauer maintained throughout that Hitler had died in the bunker, and his testimony on this point eventually contributed to the Soviets' acceptance of this fact. After his return to West Germany, Bauer wrote a memoir about his years as Hitler's pilot, a book that was published in German in 1956 under the title Hitler's Pilot. Like the Secretary's memoirs, Bauer's account focused primarily on the factual and anecdotal details of his service, while largely avoiding deep engagement with the moral dimensions of what he had participated in. This pattern, the emphasis on the professional and the experiential over the moral and the philosophical, characterizes most of the personal accounts produced by those who served in Hitler's inner circle. The contrast with Traudl Junge's approach, particularly in her later years, is instructive. Junge came to believe that the factual account was not enough, that the historical record required not only what happened, but a reckoning with why it happened and what each person who was part of it bore responsibility for. This position was not universal among the survivors of the Nazi inner circle. Many of them were content to provide the facts and leave the moral judgment to others. Junge's willingness to turn that judgment on herself is what distinguishes her legacy from those of most of the others. The Final Days Revisited. The events of April and May 1945 in the Führer bunker have been described and analysed in an enormous body of historical literature, but the first-hand accounts of the people who were there remain irreplaceable as primary sources. Traudl Junge's account of typing Hitler's final testament on the night of April 28th to 29th has been confirmed by multiple sources and is accepted by historians as accurate in its essential details. The testament itself has survived and is part of the historical record, providing direct evidence of what Hitler chose to say in his final written statement. What the testament reveals about Hitler's state of mind in those final hours is both historically significant and morally instructive. He blamed the Jews for the war that he had started. He expressed no remorse for the tens of millions who had died. He organized the succession of the German government with the apparent expectation, or at least the rhetorical performance of the expectation, that Germany would continue to exist and fight after his death. He expelled Göring and Himmler, two of the most powerful figures in the regime, for attempting to negotiate independent surrenders, and he expressed confidence in the German people while simultaneously condemning them just hours earlier in private conversation for having failed to prove themselves worthy of his vision. The woman who typed these words did not, she says, fully absorb their content in the moment. She was focused on accuracy, on keeping pace with Hitler's dictation, on the mechanical task of getting the words onto paper correctly. Whether this claim is entirely credible or whether it represents a form of retrospective self-protection is a question that readers of her account must decide for themselves. But the basic human psychology it describes, the ability to process text as a technical task while not engaging with its meaning, is real and well documented. Transcriptionists and typists have described this phenomenon in other contexts. The focused mechanical attention required for rapid, accurate transcription does in fact inhibit simultaneous comprehension in ways that are neurologically real. After Hitler dictated the testament to Junge, it was typed in multiple copies for signature and distribution. Copies were sent out of the bunker by various messengers, though not all of them reached their intended destinations. The copies that did survive have provided one of the most direct windows into Hitler's mind in the final hours of his life. They are also, incidentally, documents that Traudl Junge's fingers produced, that passed through her hands, that required her labour to bring into existence. This is the particular and indelible nature of her historical situation. Martin Bormann's disappearance. In the days immediately following Hitler's death, as the remaining inhabitants of the bunker attempted to escape from Berlin, the mystery of Martin Bormann's fate began. Bormann had been one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich and was widely hated by most of the others in the inner circle, including the secretaries who had experienced his controlling management of access to Hitler. When the escape attempt was made on the night of May 1st to 2nd, Bormann was among the group, but he was never definitively confirmed to have survived. For decades there was genuine uncertainty about whether Bormann had died in Berlin or escaped and was living somewhere under a false identity. Various sightings were reported over the years, various theories were advanced. Simon Wiesenthal and other Nazi hunters pursued leads that suggested Bormann had made it to South America, as several other prominent Nazis had done through the Ratlines network. The mystery was eventually resolved when DNA testing in the 1990s confirmed that skeletal remains found in Berlin in 1972 were genuinely Bormann's, establishing that he had indeed died in the city on the night of the escape attempt. The Bormann mystery is tangentially relevant to the Secretaries' story because several of them, including Traudl Junge, were part of the escape group that left the bunker on that night. Their accounts of the chaotic events of the escape provided some of the evidence that historians used to piece together what had happened to Bormann. Junge described seeing Bormann at various points during the chaotic movement through the city, but was not able to confirm what had happened to him afterward. The fragmented and traumatic nature of those hours meant that each survivor who made it out had only a partial account of what had occurred. The secretaries, as witnesses to this episode, illustrate more broadly the value of their testimony as historical evidence. They were not responsible for the events they described. They did not make the decisions that led to those events. But they were present, they paid attention, and they remembered. Their memories, however imperfect and however filtered through the psychological mechanisms of self-protection and denial, constitute a form of historical testimony that cannot be replaced by official documents alone. Annie Winter and the Munich household. Before Hitler became Chancellor and established himself permanently in Berlin, he had a personal household in Munich that was managed in part by Annie Winter, his housekeeper and a trusted member of his personal staff from the early days of the Nazi movement. Winter was not a secretary in the technical sense, but she was part of the broader domestic circle that included secretarial functions, and her story illustrates an aspect of Hitler's personal life that is less often discussed than the wartime years. Winter had served Hitler in Munich since the 1920s and was intimately acquainted with his personal habits, his preferences, and the domestic arrangements of his life before he achieved national power. She was present at his Munich apartment on the Prinzregentenplatz and was part of the small, trusted group who managed the practical details of his existence. After the war, she was interrogated by Allied authorities and eventually returned to private life in Munich. Like the other members of the inner circle's domestic staff, she maintained a low profile and said as little publicly as possible about her years of service. The Munich household staff represents an interesting continuity from Hitler's pre-power years to his time as Chancellor and wartime leader. Several of the people who served him in Munich in the early days continued to serve him in various capacities through the war years. The personal loyalty that Hitler inspired in some of those closest to him, a loyalty that persisted through everything and that for some endured even beyond the war's end, is one of the more disturbing psychological phenomena associated with the Nazi period. It speaks to Hitler's ability to project a personal charisma and sense of destiny that could override the rational assessment of events, even when those events were going catastrophically wrong. The role of gender in post-war accountability. One of the most significant but least discussed aspects of the post-war fates of Hitler's secretaries is the degree to which gender shaped both the nature of their work and the way they were treated by the post-war justice system. In Nazi Germany, women were officially celebrated as mothers and homemakers rather than as political or military actors. The regime's ideology insisted on a clear separation between the masculine world of politics and war and the feminine world of home and family. And yet in practice, women occupied a range of roles within the regime that belied this ideological simplification. The secretaries occupied a particularly interesting position within this dynamic. Their work was officially classified as support work, the kind of administrative and clerical labour that was considered appropriately feminine and therefore ideologically acceptable within the Nazi framework. But the actual influence they exercised, the information they had access to, and the contribution they made to the regime's functioning went far beyond what the official ideology acknowledged. They were powerful in ways that could not be named within the regime's own terms, and this unnamed power became relevant after the war in ways that shaped how they were judged. The Denazification tribunals were largely staffed by men, and their implicit assumptions about women's roles in the Nazi system were shaped by the same cultural framework that had shaped the Nazis' own view of women. Women were seen primarily as wives, mothers, and support staff rather than as political actors in their own right. This view made it easier to classify them in the lower categories of the denazification scale, as followers rather than perpetrators, even when the specific details of their service might have warranted more serious scrutiny. This gender dynamic in post-war accountability is not unique to Germany or to the Nazi period. The tendency to assess women's political and moral responsibility through a framework that assumes female passivity and political innocence has been observed in many historical contexts. In the case of Hitler's secretaries, it worked in their favour by making their denazification outcomes less serious than those of men in nominally equivalent positions. A male private secretary to Hitler, exercising the same degree of daily influence and intimate access, might have faced more serious scrutiny than the women who actually occupied those roles. Several scholars have argued that the relative leniency shown toward Nazi women in the post-war accountability process has contributed to an incomplete historical understanding of the regime and its operation. If women are systematically categorized as passive followers rather than active participants, then the historical picture of who was responsible for Nazism becomes distorted toward a view in which a small number of men were responsible for everything and millions of women were merely bystanders. The reality was considerably more complex, as the research of Wendy Lower, Catherine Kompisch and others has demonstrated. For the secretaries specifically, this means that the historical assessment of their roles and their responsibilities has continued to evolve in the decades since the war. Early accounts, often drawing on the Secretary's own self-presentations, tended toward the view of naive young women who served in a professional capacity without understanding the full implications of their work. More recent scholarship has pushed back against this framing, arguing for a more complex understanding of what it meant to choose, as an adult woman, to work at Adolf Hitler's side and to continue working there year after year as the evidence of the regime's crimes accumulated. Albert Speer and the architecture of self-exculpation. The Secretary's strategies of self-presentation in the post-war period find a parallel in the much more elaborately developed self-exculpation of Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later armaments minister. Speer, who was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison, constructed during and after his trial a carefully crafted narrative of himself as an apolitical technocrat who had served the regime's military and economic needs without knowing about or supporting its genocidal program. This narrative was accepted by the Nuremberg Tribunal to a significant degree and by a substantial portion of the Western public for decades afterward. Subsequent research has thoroughly dismantled Speer's claims of ignorance, demonstrating that he had knowledge of the deportation and murder of Jews from at least 1942, and that he directly benefited from and participated in the use of forced labor from concentration camps. The point is not to compare the secretaries directly to Speer, who was a much more senior figure with much more direct operational responsibility. The point is to illustrate that the strategy of claiming professional distance from the regime's crimes was not unique to the secretaries and was, in fact, a widely deployed post-war survival mechanism. The secretary's version of this strategy was, in some respects, more credible than Speer's, precisely because their actual role was less powerful and less directly connected to the machinery of murder. A secretary's claim that she typed documents without knowing their full implications is more plausible than a cabinet minister's claim that he managed the war economy without knowing it depended on slave labor. But the fundamental structure of the argument is similar in both cases, and the critique of that argument is also similar. Ignorance that is maintained through deliberate avoidance of uncomfortable knowledge is a form of complicity, not an exemption from it. The Holocaust remembrance context. By the time Traudl Junge's documentary was released in 2002, the global context for engaging with Holocaust memory and Nazi history had changed dramatically from the immediate post-war period. The establishment of major Holocaust memorials and research institutions, the proliferation of survivor testimony projects, the growth of Holocaust education in schools and universities across the Western world, all of these developments had created an environment in which the expectation was not simply that the crimes of the Nazi regime would be acknowledged, but that they would be remembered, studied, and used as a source of moral lessons for the present. Junge's documentary resonated so strongly with audiences precisely because it seemed to offer something that most Holocaust-related historical material does not, namely a first-person account from someone who had been on the perpetrator's side of the line rather than the victim's side, and who was willing to subject herself to genuine moral scrutiny rather than simply providing factual information. Most accounts of the Holocaust and the Nazi period are told from the perspective of victims, survivors, or outside observers. Junge's perspective was different, and its rarity made it valuable. The reception of the documentary in Germany was particularly significant. German audiences in 2002 were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who had served in or supported the Nazi regime. For them, the question of individual responsibility for the crimes of the regime was not abstract, but deeply personal. Many of them had grandparents or great-grandparents who had held positions analogous to Junge's, positions that involved some degree of service to or complicity with the regime without involving direct participation in atrocities. Junge's account gave them a framework for thinking about those family histories that was honest about the complexity and the moral weight without being either exculpatory or simply condemnatory. The political context also mattered. Germany in the early 2000s was still processing the implications of reunification in 1990, which had brought the former East Germany, with its own different relationship to the Nazi past and to the communist regime that had followed it, into the new unified state. The reunified Germany was also more assertive in international affairs than the cautious, self-restrained West Germany of the Cold War years, and this raised fresh questions about German national identity, historical memory, and the relationship between the present and the past. In this context, a film that showed ordinary Germans behaving in recognizably human ways within the Nazi system, neither monsters nor heroes but something more complicated and more familiar, served an important cultural function. It made the history feel relevant to the present rather than safely distant from it, and it invited the audience into a kind of moral reflection that simpler narratives of Nazi evil did not allow for. The Secretaries in academic history beyond the documentaries and memoirs, the Secretaries have become subjects of academic historical analysis in ways that go significantly beyond the simple factual chronicle of what happened to them after the war. Historians working on the social history of the Nazi regime, on the history of women in the Third Reich, on the psychology of ordinary people within totalitarian systems, and on the broader question of how genocide is implemented at the organizational level, have all found the Secretaries' stories to be revealing and important. The historian Ian Kershaw, whose 2-volume biography of Hitler is widely regarded as the definitive English-language treatment of the subject, made use of the Secretary's accounts in constructing his portrait of Hitler, the private man. Kershaw's analysis of Hitler's personality, his methods of governance, and his relationships with those around him draws on the testimony of the Secretaries among many other sources. The picture that emerges from Kershaw's work, consistent with the Secretary's own accounts, is of a man who combined genuine personal charisma with an utter absence of normal human empathy for those outside his ideological circle. The Secretary's accounts have also been used in the growing body of scholarship on the implementation of the final solution, specifically in discussions of how the decision-making process around the Holocaust was structured and communicated. The question of when and how the decision to implement systematic genocide was made, and how that decision was communicated through the various levels of the Nazi hierarchy, is one that historians have debated extensively. The Secretary's testimony about the atmosphere and the internal communications of the Führerhauptquartier provides some relevant context for this debate, though it cannot resolve it. More recently, historians working on what might be called the social microhistory of the Nazi regime, the day-to-day texture of life within the institutions of the Third Reich, have found the Secretary's accounts particularly valuable. These accounts describe not just the big historical events, but the small ones, the daily briefings, the meals, the conversations, the interpersonal dynamics, the moments of humour and tedium and fear and excitement that made up the actual experience of living and working within the Nazi system. This granular material helps historians understand how the regime functioned as a social institution, not just as a political and military organization. The Wolf's Lair and its inhabitants. To understand fully what the Secretaries experienced during the war years, it is worth spending more time on the physical and psychological environment of the Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, the primary Führerhauptquartier during the years of the Eastern Front campaign. Located in the Masurian forests of East Prussia, near the town of Rastenburg, the Wolf's Lair was a compound of bunkers, barracks, and administrative buildings surrounded by multiple security perimeters, extensive minefields, and a strict access control system that made it effectively impregnable to outside intrusion. The compound was operational from June 1941, when Hitler moved there to oversee the launch of Operation Barbarossa, until November 1944, when the advancing Soviet forces made it necessary to abandon it. For over 3 years, this remote forest compound in the Polish-Lithuanian border region was in many respects the true centre of Nazi power. Military decisions affecting millions of lives were made there. The coordination of the Holocaust, the management of the war economy, the diplomatic maneuvering of the regime, all of these things were handled in one way or another through the administrative apparatus of the Wolf's Lair. The Secretaries who worked there described an environment of profound psychological claustrophobia. The forests that surrounded the compound blocked out light and air. The security perimeters made it impossible to leave without authorization. The absence of normal civilian life, no shops, no restaurants, no public spaces, no contact with anyone outside the narrow world of the compound created a sense of isolation that many described as crushing. Eva Braun, who visited occasionally, famously hated the place and called it a concentration camp, a comment that has a grim irony given its source. Christa Schroeder, who spent more time at the Wolf's Lair than any of the other Secretaries, described the experience of working there as one of the most oppressive of her life. The The constant presence of uniformed military officers, the heavy atmosphere created by the ongoing military failures on the Eastern Front after the initial victories of 1941, the knowledge that outside the wire the war was going badly, all of these things contributed to an environment in which the mood was often grim, anxious, and tense. Hitler himself became more withdrawn and volatile as the military situation deteriorated, and his moods set the emotional tone for the entire compound. The secretaries had to navigate these moods with considerable skill. When Hitler was in a black temper, everyone around him tensed and contracted, keeping a low profile, speaking only when spoken to, avoiding anything that might attract his wrath. When he was in a more expansive mood, the atmosphere relaxed, and the dinners and informal conversations that Junge described in her memoir could have an almost pleasant quality. Learning to read Hitler's moods and to calibrate one's behavior accordingly was an essential survival skill for anyone in his immediate circle, and the secretaries, by virtue of their daily proximity to him, became adepts at it. This kind of constant emotional vigilance in the presence of an unpredictable authority figure is itself a form of psychological stress, and its cumulative effect over years of service must have been considerable. The secretaries rarely described this aspect of their experience directly, perhaps because they had normalized it so thoroughly that it did not register as unusual, or perhaps because describing it would have required them to acknowledge a level of fear and subordination that conflicted with the more dignified self-presentation they sought in their memoirs and interviews. Stalingrad and the turning point. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, when the German Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed by Soviet forces, marked a decisive psychological turning point not only in the war, but in the inner world of the Führer Hauptquartier. The loss of an entire army, more than 300,000 men killed, captured, or missing, shattered the atmosphere of confident expectation that had characterized the headquarters in the early years of the Eastern Front campaign. The secretaries who were present during this period described a Hitler who was visibly shaken by the Stalingrad catastrophe, though he was reluctant to admit it publicly. His famous refusal to allow the Sixth Army to break out when a breakout might still have been possible, his insistence on holding the encirclement because he could not face the psychological implications of retreat was a decision made in the headquarters, in the rooms where the secretaries worked. They did not participate in it, but they were present in the institution where it was made, and they knew its consequences as they unfolded. After Stalingrad, the atmosphere at the Wolf's Lair never fully recovered its early confidence. There were periods of optimism, as when the Germans held the line on the Eastern Front through much of 1943, and when the Allied landings in Italy initially seemed manageable. But the underlying trajectory was one of growing catastrophe, and by 1944 this was undeniable to almost everyone in the headquarters. The secretaries were not military analysts, but they were not blind either. They could see what the maps showed. They could hear what the officers around them were saying in unguarded moments. The sense that Germany was losing the war, and losing it catastrophically, must have penetrated even the most carefully maintained personal detachment. How this awareness affected the secretaries' psychological relationship to their work and to the man they served is a question that their accounts address only obliquely. Junge described a period of profound disillusionment in the later war years, a growing sense that the promises of the regime had been hollow and that the catastrophe unfolding around her was not, as Nazi propaganda insisted, the result of external enemies and internal traitors, but of fundamental strategic miscalculations and ideological madness at the top. But she stayed. They all stayed. Whatever doubts they had, whatever fears they harboured, they continued to show up each day and do their jobs. The Führer bunker in its final weeks. The final chapter of the Secretary's wartime experience was the Führer bunker itself, the underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, where Hitler spent the last months of his life and where the regime made its final desperate stand. The bunker was completed in its final form in February 1945 when the military situation had deteriorated to the point that remaining above ground in Berlin was becoming genuinely dangerous. Soviet and Western Allied air raids continued to pound the city, and the ground war was approaching Germany's borders on all fronts. The physical environment of the bunker was itself a powerful symbol of the regime's final state. It was underground, literally buried, hidden from the world above. It was cramped and poorly ventilated. The constant running of generators and air conditioning systems made a mechanical drone that never ceased. The concrete walls sweated moisture. The space was divided into small rooms and corridors that created a maze-like quality. For the secretaries and others who worked there, the bunker represented the ultimate reduction of the world to a small, airless, underground space entirely cut off from the larger reality outside. Traudl Junge's description of life in the bunker during its final weeks is one of the most vivid and widely quoted accounts of the fall of the Third Reich. She described the surreal quality of the existence there, the contrast between the ongoing formalities of the Nazi hierarchy, the briefings, the salutes, the uniforms, the protocol, and the obvious reality that it was all collapsing. She described people going through the motions of their official roles, even as those roles had ceased to have any practical meaning. She described Hitler increasingly disconnected from reality, conducting strategy sessions about armies that had ceased to exist, ordering counterattacks from divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier. The quality of the final days in the bunker that comes through most powerfully in Junge's account is the combination of horror and the mundane. People were terrified, grieving, desperate, but they were also eating meals, gossiping, caring about the small social dynamics of the underground community. The human animal's need for routine. And normalcy persists even in the most extreme circumstances, and the bunker survivors' accounts illustrate this with a vividness that no amount of abstract description could match. The question of remorse. In assessing the post-war lives of Hitler's secretaries, the question of whether they felt and expressed genuine remorse for their service is one that historians and the general public have returned to repeatedly. The answer varies significantly depending on which secretary we are considering, and it has also evolved over time as the cultural climate around remembrance of the Nazi period has changed. Traudl Junge's trajectory toward genuine public acknowledgement of her own moral failure, however imperfect and delayed that acknowledgement was, stands as the most fully realized expression of remorse among the secretaries. Her decision, after decades of relative silence, to commit her recollections to paper and then to speak on camera about her experiences and her feelings, represented a kind of moral courage that deserves recognition even from those who believe she should have spoken sooner or gone further. The Blind Spot documentary is not a comfortable watch. It is the account of an old woman confronting the choices of her youth with an honesty that is painful precisely because it is incomplete. She sees finally, but she is not sure she sees everything, and she knows she cannot undo what was done. Christa Schroeder's trajectory was very different. Her memoir, with its professional framing and its emotional distance from the deeper questions, represents a form of engagement with the past that stops well short of remorse. She provided the facts. She acknowledged her service. She did not weep or express regret or subject herself to the kind of public self-examination that Junge eventually undertook. Whether this reflects a genuine absence of remorse or a private emotional life that was simply not on display is impossible to determine from the outside. Johanna Wolf's near-total silence after the war can be read in multiple ways. It might represent a form of shame too deep to articulate. It might represent a conviction that what she had done required no apology. It might simply represent the personality of a private person who had always been more comfortable in the background than in the spotlight. What it does not provide is anything that an outside observer could recognize as remorse or accountability. She lived out her long life in Munich without, as far as the public record shows, ever saying publicly that she had done anything wrong. Gerda Christian's post-war life, divided between her work in the fashion industry, her divorce and her eventual remarriage and quiet retirement in Dusseldorf, presents a similar picture of someone who chose to rebuild and move forward rather than to look back. She participated occasionally in historical research, as mentioned, but she was not a public figure, and she did not produce a memoir. The impression she left for posterity is of someone who wanted very much to be left alone with whatever private relationship she had to her past. The relationship between private guilt and public expression is one that runs through all of these cases in different ways. Guilt, the genuine psychological experience of having done something wrong or having failed to do something right, is an internal state. It does not automatically express itself publicly. Many people carry profound, private guilt about choices they made or failed to make while presenting a composed and unrevealing face to the world. The secretaries may have felt more than they showed, or they may genuinely have achieved a state of psychological equilibrium that did not include significant guilt. We cannot know for certain, and it would be presumptuous to assume. What we can say is that the gap between what these women had experienced and what they were publicly willing to acknowledge is historically significant. The secretaries were among the best positioned witnesses to the inner workings of the Third Reich that history has left us. Their willingness or unwillingness to speak, their honesty or evasiveness in what they said, their engagement or avoidance with the moral dimensions of their service, all of these things have shaped what we know and what we can know about the Nazi period. The historical record that exists is partly a product of their choices about how to engage with their pasts. The reintegration of former Nazis. The post-war reintegration of people who had served the Nazi regime into West German society is one of the most controversial aspects of the Federal Republic's early history. The evidence accumulated by historians in recent decades has made clear that the reintegration was far more extensive and less scrutinized than official accounts suggested. Former Nazi officials held positions in the West German government, judiciary, foreign service, and security apparatus. Former SS officers and concentration camp guards returned to civilian life and in many cases to professional careers without serious legal consequences. The denazification process, whatever its original intentions, proved far too limited and far too easily gamed to accomplish a genuine purging of Nazi perpetrators from West German public life. The Secretaries' reintegration into West German society was essentially frictionless by comparison with the experiences of those who faced more serious legal jeopardy. For them, returning to civilian life meant finding work, finding housing, and finding a way to live with the past, not navigating complex legal proceedings or hiding from authorities. This relative ease of reintegration is in itself significant. It reflects the combination of their actual legal situation, which was clear, and the broader cultural preference in post-war West Germany for not pressing too hard on the question of individual complicity. The economic miracle of the 1950s, the extraordinary rapid recovery and growth of the West German economy in the decade following the war, also played a role in enabling reintegration. A booming economy needs workers, including secretaries, editors, and administrators. The skills that women like Traudl Junge and Christa Schroeder had developed during their wartime service were entirely transferable to civilian employment. Their work histories were, practically speaking, easy to present in ways that omitted or minimized the context in which those skills had been developed. A woman who had spent years as a typist and editor at a major government installation was, on paper, a perfectly qualified applicant for civilian secretarial and editorial work, regardless of what that government installation had been doing. The Adenauer era and historical silence. The early Federal Republic under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer was characterized by a deliberate political choice to prioritize economic recovery, Western integration, and anti-communism over the comprehensive accounting of Nazi crimes. Adenauer himself was a firm anti-Nazi who had been persecuted by the regime, but his government employed a number of former Nazi officials and explicitly chose not to press for widespread criminal accountability for wartime crimes, arguing that such accountability would be socially destabilizing and would impede the recovery of the new democratic state. This political choice created the cultural atmosphere in which the secretaries and millions of other former members or supporters of the Nazi system were able to reintegrate without significant public reckoning. The unspoken social compact of the early Federal Republic was essentially that the Nazi period would not be discussed too loudly or too specifically if everyone could agree to move on and build the new Germany together. This compact broke down gradually over the 1960s and 1970s as a younger generation that had not participated in the war began demanding answers. But in the critical early post-war decades it held, and it shaped the context in which the secretaries rebuilt their lives. The Eichmann trial and its impact. A significant turning point in German and international engagement with the Nazi period came with the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann had been the SS officer, primarily responsible for the logistical organization of the deportation of Jews to the death camps across occupied Europe. He had escaped Germany after the war and had been living in Argentina under an assumed name when Israeli intelligence agents captured him in 1960 and brought him to Israel for trial. The Eichmann trial was the first major post-war Nazi trial to be televised, and it was watched by audiences across Europe, including in Germany. The detailed testimony about the implementation of the final solution that was presented during the trial forced a confrontation with the reality of the Holocaust that the early Federal Republic's culture of silence had made it possible to avoid. For many Germans, including many who had served in subordinate capacities during the Nazi period, the Eichmann trial was a moment when evasion became harder. The political theorist Hannah Arendt attended the Eichmann trial as a reporter for the New Yorker magazine and produced her famous analysis of it in the book Eichmann in Jerusalem, published in 1963 with its controversial concept of the banality of evil. Arendt's observation that Eichmann was not a monster but a bureaucrat, not a fanatic ideologue but a careerist, that the evil he participated in was implemented through the ordinary mechanisms of organizational behavior rather than through extraordinary individual malice, was one of the most discussed and debated ideas in the post-war intellectual landscape. The connection between Arendt's concept and the Secretaries' situation is one that historians and cultural commentators have drawn repeatedly. If the banality of evil applies to Eichmann, the man who organized the deportation of millions of people to their deaths, how much more does it apply to the secretaries who typed the documents in the office down the hall? The secretaries were, in many respects, even more mundanely ordinary in their role than Eichmann. They exercised even less formal power. They were even more clearly performing a support function rather than a decision-making one. And yet, they were there in the same system, contributing to the same enterprise. The Nuremberg Precedent. The Nuremberg trials, which ran from November 1945 to October 1946 and tried 24 major Nazi war criminals before an international military tribunal, established legal precedents that shaped how the post-war world thought about individual responsibility for state crimes. The trials affirmed that following superior orders was not an adequate defense against charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, that individuals had a responsibility to refuse orders that violated fundamental moral and legal principles. This principle was directly relevant to the secretaries' situation, even though the secretaries themselves were not tried at Nuremberg or at the subsequent proceedings. The principle established at Nuremberg was that everyone who participated in the Nazi enterprise, at whatever level, had an obligation to refuse participation if that participation required them to contribute to crimes against humanity. The secretaries did not refuse. They continued their work. Whether they could have refused and what would have happened if they had tried are questions that their accounts do not fully address. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, which ran from 1946 to 1949 and tried various categories of defendants, including doctors, judges, members of the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units, and senior industrialists, filled in more of the picture of how the Nazi system had functioned. These trials also addressed the complicity of people in subordinate and support roles, establishing that it was not only the senior decision-makers who bore legal and moral responsibility, but also those who had contributed to the implementation of criminal orders at various organizational levels. None of the secretaries was tried at Nuremberg or in the subsequent proceedings. This fact is historically interesting in itself. It reflects the legal determination that their specific roles did not constitute prosecutable offences under the definitions being applied. It also reflects the practical reality that the Nuremberg proceedings, enormous as they were, could try only a fraction of the people who had participated in the Nazi system, and the selection of defendants was necessarily focused on those with the greatest formal power and the most direct responsibility for the most egregious crimes. The legacy they left. The historical legacy of Hitler's secretaries is paradoxically larger than their actual power and influence during the war years would suggest. They are important not because of what they did, which was by the standards of the regime relatively modest, but because of what they saw and remembered and eventually told. Their testimony has been woven into the fabric of our understanding of the Nazi period at the most intimate level, the level of daily life inside the headquarters, the texture of Hitler's personality, the atmosphere of the final days. Without them, we would know much less about these things. Traudl Junge's Until the Final Hour has been translated into multiple languages and is used in history courses around the world. The Downfall film, which drew so heavily on her account, has been seen by tens of millions of people and has shaped the popular understanding of the Nazi collapse for a generation. The extraordinary online cultural phenomenon of the Downfall bunker parody videos, in which the scene of Hitler receiving bad news in the bunker has been subtitled with countless different subjects, has introduced the film and indirectly Junge's account to audiences who would never have sought out historical material about the Nazi period. This cultural diffusion of Junge's testimony is strange and in some ways troubling, but it is also evidence of the power of the story she told. Christa Schroeder's war mein Chef remains in print in German and has been translated into English, providing historians with details about Hitler's domestic life and private behaviour that are not available from official sources. Her portrait of Hitler as a domestic figure, with his dietary quirks and his hatred of tobacco smoke and his late-night monologues, has contributed to the scholarly literature on Nazi leadership and on Hitler's psychology. Johanna Wolf's silence is itself a kind of historical artifact. The absence of her testimony from the public record is a reminder that not everyone who witnessed the Nazi period chose to speak, and that the historical record is inevitably shaped by who was willing to talk as well as by what happened. Her refusal to engage, her long decades of privacy in Munich, is part of the story of how Germans who had served the regime processed the aftermath. The Perpetrator Testimony Challenge. Historians who work with the testimony of people like Hitler's secretaries face a methodological challenge that does not arise in the same way when working with documentary sources. The secretaries' accounts are inevitably shaped by the circumstances and motivations of the people who produced them. They were produced at specific moments in time for specific audiences, with specific purposes in mind. The interrogation transcripts were produced under conditions of captivity and potential legal jeopardy. The memoirs were produced for publication, with all the pressures and incentives that publication entails. The documentary interviews were produced for a camera, for an audience, for posterity. None of this means the accounts are false or useless. It means that they must be read critically, with attention to the conditions of their production and the interests they serve. A secretary who, in her memoir, emphasizes her ignorance of the Holocaust is not necessarily lying, but she is also not necessarily telling the whole truth. The historian's task is to read between the lines, to compare different accounts of the same events, to notice inconsistencies and absences, and to arrive at the most accurate picture possible, while acknowledging the limits of what can be known. This interpretive challenge is particularly acute with Traudl Junge precisely because her account is the most elaborate and the most self-conscious. She was aware of how her testimony would be received and interpreted. She was aware of the historical significance of what she was saying. She was aware of the moral expectations of her audience. All of this awareness inevitably shaped what she said and how she said it. The result is a document that is simultaneously more honest than most comparable accounts and more carefully constructed. These two qualities are not mutually exclusive. A person can be genuinely engaged in self-examination while also controlling the terms on which that examination is performed. The ordinary people problem. Hitler's secretaries are ultimately one small piece of a much larger historical puzzle that has preoccupied scholars since the end of the Second World War. The puzzle is sometimes called the ordinary people problem, and it was given its most famous formulation by the historian Christopher Browning in his 1992 book Ordinary Men, which examined a police battalion of middle-aged German men who carried out mass shootings of Jews in occupied Poland. Browning's question was how ordinary, unremarkable men who had no particular ideological commitment to mass murder became killers. His answer, developed through detailed analysis of the perpetrator's testimony and records, involved a complex interplay of peer pressure, deference to authority, situational factors, and the gradual normalization of previously unthinkable acts. The secretaries are not the Reserve Police Battalion 101 of Browning's study. They did not shoot people. They typed and filed and transcribed and organized. But the broader question his work raises applies to them as well. How did ordinary, unremarkable young women with no particular ideological fanaticism become the personal secretaries of a genocidal dictator and continue in that role for years while millions of people were being systematically murdered? The mechanisms Browning identified, deference to authority, situational pressure, the normalization of complicity, the power of institutional belonging, are all visible in the secretaries' stories. This connection to the broader scholarly literature on perpetrators and bystanders is what gives the Secretaries' story its significance beyond their individual lives. They are not historically important, primarily because of who they personally were or what they personally did. They are historically important as examples of a phenomenon that was widespread in Nazi Germany and that recurs in various forms in other societies and other historical contexts. The capacity of ordinary people to serve evil systems, to contribute to catastrophic crimes through the performance of mundane tasks, to maintain their self-regard and their sense of professionalism while doing so. This capacity is one of the most disturbing and important truths that the history of the Nazi period has to teach. What can we learn? The post-war fates of Hitler's secretaries, ranging from Traudl Junge's delayed but genuine moral reckoning to Johanna Wolf's complete public silence, map the range of responses available to people who find themselves, through a combination of circumstance and choice, having served a monstrous regime. None of them was sentenced to prison. None of them was executed. None of them faced the kind of formal accountability that was reserved for those who had wielded formal power within the regime. They returned to civilian life, found work, grew old, and died. Their lives after 1945 were, in the external sense, relatively normal, but the internal reality was more complex. The women who served at Hitler's side carried the weight of what they had witnessed and participated in with them for the rest of their lives, processing it in ways that ranged from honest confrontation to near total denial. The degree to which they engaged with that weight varied enormously. The degree to which their engagement was honest and complete varied further still. What they all shared was the experience of having been inside one of the most destructive events in human history and then having to figure out how to live afterward. The lesson, if there is one that can be simply stated, is not that these women were uniquely evil or uniquely guilty. It is that the capacity for complicity in evil is ordinary, that it does not require fanaticism or malice aforethought, that it can coexist with professional competence and personal decency, and a genuine unawareness of the full scope of what one is contributing to. This is a disturbing lesson. It would be more comforting to believe that the people who served Hitler were monsters, clearly different from the rest of us. The testimony of his secretaries makes that comfortable belief very difficult to sustain. Traudl Junge articulated this better than anyone. Looking back at her young self, the girl who had applied for a job in the Reich Chancellery in 1942 without fully understanding where it would lead, she did not see a monster. She saw someone like herself, someone who had wanted a good job, who had been flattered by the attention of powerful men, who had been seduced by the proximity to history, who had been too young and too absorbed in the immediate details of her work to ask the questions that would have forced her to confront what it all meant. And then she saw an old woman who had spent decades living with the consequences of having been that young person, who had learned, too late to change anything, what she should have asked and done and refused. That is a story that deserves to be remembered. Not because Traudl Junge was exceptional, but precisely because she was not. She was ordinary. She was someone who could have been any of us in different circumstances, in a different time. And that is the most important and the most uncomfortable truth her life has to offer. The story of Hitler's secretaries is ultimately a story about the relationship between proximity and responsibility, about how close you can stand to evil without becoming evil yourself, and about what you owe to the truth when the evil you stood close to finally comes to light. It is a story that Germany has been working through for 80 years, and the world has been watching and learning from that process. The secretaries who typed Hitler's words, who sat at his table, who escaped through the ruins of his capital, and who then lived out their long, quiet, complicated lives in post-war Germany, these women are part of that story. They are not its heroes, but they are among its most telling witnesses. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about what happened to Hitler's secretaries after World War II, make sure to check out our video about what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, and our video about what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after the war. These stories explore similar questions of guilt, memory, and survival in the aftermath of the Third Reich. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.